So I'm going to slowly get us kicked off here and then turn it over to our presider and speaker today. I want to thank you all for coming to our inaugural event in the Engaged Anekāntavāda speaker series. This is a speaker series that was provided by the generous support of the Uberoi Foundation for the grant that they gave us for 2026 for our project Engaged Anekāntavāda. And this is one of the core components to it. And I'm so glad that we were able to pull together the incredible colleagues that we have to make this happen. And today you're going to be hearing from two of these very special colleagues, one of whom is presiding over all of our events for us, Professor Anil Mundra, and I will let him introduce our speaker, Raja Rosenhagen. And I'm also joined by my colleague, Diana Hewlett, who has been helpful in so many of our events. And so thank you for being here and for supporting this talk. So here we are in the Engaged Anekāntavāda speaker series. We're going to have 4 talks. This is the inaugural talk today. And I'm very pleased to introduce and hand it over to my colleague, Anil Mundra at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He's going to be presiding and moderating this and the other events. Dr. Anil Mundra is the Bhagvan Vimalnath Assistant Professor of Jain Studies and South Asian Religions in the Department of Religious Studies of the University of California, Santa Barbara. He's previously served as the Alka Siddhartha Dalal Postdoctoral Fellow for the study of Jainism at Rutgers University in New Brunswick. And his research focuses on how South Asian philosophers navigate religious diversity, especially in Sanskrit texts, on the classical Jain theory of non-one-sidedness, Anekāntavāda. And it's for this reason that we very enthusiastically asked Anil to collaborate with us on this speaker series for his expertise and his ability to preside and moderate over the discussions for each of our speakers. So with that, it gives me great pleasure to turn it over to my colleague, Professor Anil Mundra at University of California, Santa Barbara. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Chris. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for having me here. I'm really honored. I want to say that I first got interested in doing research on Anekāntavāda because I thought it seemed like a really promising way to deal with a whole bunch of challenges that we face in the world, right? But that just how it might do that, just how it works, is not quite obvious and maybe not very well understood. So I've devoted my research energy towards, just trying to understand how some of its foremost proponents in the Jain tradition have understood it and used it. And then the next question is, not necessarily these two questions don't have to be pursued in serial. They can be pursued simultaneously in tandem. But there's the interpretive question about the historical tradition, and then the next question is how can we use it, right? How can we use it for our own present concerns, and importantly, how can we not misuse it, right? Because like any powerful tool, Anekāntavāda can also be misused. All powerful tools can be misused, and Anekāntavāda surely is a powerful tool. So I'm really glad and honored to be part of this series and to learn from our speakers. I feel like as I say, I've been doing my best to try to understand the classical tradition, but don't yet myself have very well formed ideas about exactly how to apply it in today's world. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from our speakers. So we've sought to curate a series of scholars that have a somewhat rare combination, right? Both academically rigorous and also really concerned to apply what they know. Right? The typical connotation of the word academic, right, is that it's rarefied in the ivory tower and not applied. Those two terms, academic and applied, are often opposed to each other. We've tried to find people who do both. And I believe Raja Rosenhagen is definitely one of those in my book. So Dr. Rosenhagen is assistant professor at the California State University in Fresno, known colloquially as Fresno State University. He's in the Department of Philosophy there with a special emphasis on peace and nonviolence studies. Before coming to Fresno State, he was at the University of Pittsburgh at as their inaugural Bhagwan Vasupujya Swami postdoctoral scholar in Jain studies. He also did his doctorate there at Pitt in their hallowed philosophy department. And in between, he was associate professor of philosophy at Ashoka University in India. He's written across a very wide range of fields, from epistemology, analytical, and what I think we could call social epistemology, to moral theory and the philosophy of love, from Vishishtadvaita Vedanta to, of course, Anekāntavāda. He's currently writing a book called Thinking with the Jains, in which he argues that Anekāntavāda provides a general constraint on reasoning and presents a distinctive kind of negation that's uniquely self-limiting. The structure he works to carve out offers new impulses for major debates in contemporary analytic philosophy, not just debates in ethics and nonviolence, but also paradox theory, philosophical logic, philosophy of math, epistemology, metaphysics, and philosophy of language. So we'll hear from Dr. Rosenhagen, and then we'll have a chance for some discussion with him afterwards. Since this is a webinar, no one will be able to speak directly. So please be thinking about the questions that you would like to type out and put in the Q&A. The audience members also don't have privileges to post in the chat. So please post your questions in the Q&A and start writing them as you think of them as Dr. Rosenhagen is speaking, and we'll get them answered afterwards. So without further ado, let me extend a warm welcome to all of you in the audience, and welcome Dr. Rosenhagen.
Many thanks, many thanks. Now, let me begin by thanking the Arianta Institute and Chris Miller for the invitation to speak in this series, and the Uberoi Foundation for its generous support. And I'm thankful and grateful to you, Anil, for your kind introduction and for taking on the role of presider. And of course, finally, last but not least, to the members of the audience who are taking the time to attend this event. It's a real honor to serve as the first speaker in this series, and I'm very much looking forward to the talks that will follow. They promise to be both rich and thought-provoking, so audience members do stay connected. More talks are coming. Now, the question I want to begin with is a familiar one, though we don't usually put it this way. What happens when we cannot say what matters? Consider something as ordinary as contacting customer service. You're given a set of options. You listen through them, you wait, you try to find the closest match. Often it's very easy to do certain things, like you can always make a payment or confirm a detail. But if you try to explain a situation that doesn't quite fit, it becomes much harder. You are asked to select from categories that don't quite capture your case. You adjust what you say so that it fits. You repeat yourself, and even when you reach a person, they may be operating within the same constraints. At some point, it dawns on you that, what's going on is, or the issue is not simply that the system doesn't understand you. It is that it only allows certain kinds of things to be said. What does not fit those options does not really count. The issue is not just your frustration, it's the absence of space to be understood. Now, I take this to be a small but revealing example of a broader pattern. Something similar happens in everyday disagreements, including within families, where differences quickly become conflicts because each perspective is taken to be absolute or complete. In public discourse, too, positions are often presented as if they exhausted the situation, leaving little room for alternative ways of seeing them. Social media environments further intensify this tendency by encouraging rapid, unqualified responses so that differences are quickly polarized rather than sustained. Strong absolutist signals, it seems, almost always beat nuance. Across these domains, then, what differs is not simply what is said, but whether there's room for differences to appear at all. So what these cases share, I suggest, is not simply disagreement or limitation, but a particular kind of extension. Whether we're dealing with interpersonal situations such as family disagreements, shared social spaces, or institutional systems, the same pattern appears. A limited perspective is treated as if it were sufficient for whatever arises. I will refer to this as overreach. Overreach is not an error of content, what we say, but an error of scope, where it is applicable and where it isn't. A standpoint that we're taking that may be appropriate within certain conditions is extended beyond those conditions and taken to define the situation as such, or all situations. In interpersonal contexts, this can take the form of treating one's own perspective as decisive in a disagreement. In shared social spaces, it can appear as the implicit assumption that one's own needs, as this man's or gentleman's needs in the picture, or presence define what counts. And in systemic contexts, such as those structured by algorithmic or procedural frameworks, it takes the form of predefined categories or models being treated as exhaustive. In line with the topic of this series, I'll approach this problem of overreach through the concept of Anekāntavāda. Anekāntavāda, literally non-one-sidedness, or the doctrine of non-one-sidedness, is neither a principle of tolerance, as it's sometimes phrased, nor the claim that all perspectives are equally valid. It is, in fact, itself a many-sided expression, and the sense that interests me here is the sense of it as a discipline governing the extension of claims, a way of recognizing and maintaining their limits. On this reading, no standpoint may be treated as exhaustive of what it takes up. In this sense, overreach is a form of structural violence, not because it intends harm necessarily, but because it fails to leave room for what cannot be accommodated within a given framework. When a limited standpoint is treated as exhaustive, what lies outside its scope cannot appear as something that matters. What I would suggest then is that Anekāntavāda already contains the resources to diagnose such forms of overreach. It provides not only a way of describing plurality, but a normative framework for determining when a standpoint is being illegitimately extended. By making the limits of articulations and standpoints and actions explicit, it preserves the space in which difference can appear, without requiring that it be either resolved or eliminated. So that's sort of what I'll be talking about, and we start with overreach. Overreach, I said, is an error of scope. If we take this seriously, the main question is not whether a given perspective is right or wrong, but how it is extended beyond the confines of the situations within which it operates. What matters is whether what we say, assume, or do remains within the conditions under which these things are warranted. Overreach arises when what is assertable under certain conditions is treated as if it were assertable independently of those or any conditions, and when what is appropriate to do under certain conditions is taken to be appropriate absolutely. You can speak in one way to your children, but not in the same way to your teachers. You can sit one way on your sofa at home, but not the same way on a public train. To forget this is to overreach. What you say, assume, or do is no longer treated as conditioned by circumstances, but as sufficient not just in those conditions, but for any situation. The conditions that make it meaningful or justified are no longer marked and heeded. Every perspective, framework, or mode of engagement brings certain features into focus while leaving others aside. Perspectives are limited. Such selectivity is not a defect. It's what makes situation-specific orientation possible. We can't take up a situation except by taking it up in some particular way. The problem arises when this selectivity is no longer recognized, when an approach that may work within a limited range is taken to be the approach to take regardless of circumstances, and when actions guided by it are taken to be fully justified by it. Once one has absolutized a perspective, what lies outside one's operative framework does not simply remain unaddressed. It becomes difficult to register at all, and therefore difficult to respond to. It can't easily be brought into articulation because the available forms of articulation from within the absolutized perspective are already structured in a way that does not accommodate it. Nor can it guide action because the range of what counts as an appropriate response has already been fixed. Remember the chatbot case. The issue then is not merely that something's left out, but that the conditions under which it could appear and be acted upon are no longer available. This helps explain why the problem of living with difference takes the form that it does. Difference becomes difficult not because it exceeds our capacities, but because we enact and encounter ways of taking up situations that do not register their own limits, where what is conditionally assertable is treated as if it were unconditionally applicable, and what is conditionally appropriate to do is treated as if it were generally warranted. What falls outside that range has no place to appear or to matter. What is needed, therefore, is not an increase in perspectives, but a discipline in their use, a kind of scope discipline, ensuring that what is asserted, assumed, and done remains tied to the conditions that license it. Now, in contemporary contexts, the dynamics just described are intensified. Many of the systems that structure interaction today predefine the conditions under which something can be said, registered, or acted upon. But these conditions are not encountered symmetrically. They shape not only what can be expressed, but also how situations are taken up and responded to. In some cases, this can result in certain perspectives not being articulated at all, not because they are rejected, but because the available forms do not allow them to appear in a way that would be recognized as something that can or should be taken into account. Now, what is distinctive about our current situation is not that overreach occurs, but that the conditions under which it occurs are now built into the systems we rely on. In such cases, overreach is no longer merely a feature of our individual judgments, assumptions, or actions. It becomes built into the operation of the system itself. This is evident in interfaces that restrict articulation to predefined options, like in a chatbot. What cannot be expressed within those options cannot enter into consideration. The limitation is not itself the problem. The problem is that this limitation is treated as sufficient. What falls outside it doesn't count. You can't say what your individual case is about because there is no option to ever say it. And in some cases, it doesn't therefore even come to be expressed at all. A similar structure appears in environments that privilege speed and decisiveness, where responses are produced rapidly and without qualification, such as in many social media environments. The marking of the scope tends to disappear. Who is saying it? Under which conditions? And with what justification? What is asserted is presented without indication of the conditions under which it holds. Difference is not sustained but polarized as perspectives are extended without restraint. Large language models too exhibit this pattern in particularly clear form. Their outputs are generated on the basis of probabilistic relations within a limited context. What is produced is conditioned by what is locally available and statistically likely, given the system's limited training data. Yet it is presented as if it were simply what is the case. That's where students often struggle. And others too. At the same time, and importantly, the scope established within a conversation with an AI system is not reliably maintained. Constraints that the user introduces earlier may drop out, not because they are rejected, but because they no longer fall within the model's operative range. What is locally assertable or available in the system's memory is thus repeatedly treated as if it were sufficient more generally. A related form of overreach can be observed in systems that determine what one is shown, such as social media feeds or targeted advertising. These systems operate on the basis of limited indicators of your attention or preference, what can be tracked, such as clicks, pauses, and patterns of engagement. The selectivity is not itself problematic. The difficulty arises when what is captured in this way by the system is treated as sufficient for determining what should be presented to you next. A partial model of attention is extended beyond the conditions under which it is valid without registering other relevant factors, whether one has already spent too much time on the social media feed, whether the content is appropriate, or whether other considerations should limit what is shown, like whether you are a minor or not, for instance. What is locally predictive in these systems is treated as if it were sufficient more generally. Across these cases, then, the same structure is visible. A bounded process, a conditioned bounded process, limited process yields outputs that are not marked as bounded, and overreach is not corrected but amplified. so that the failure to register scope is reproduced at scale. This becomes particularly visible in what are often described as bubbles or echo chambers, right? What appears as relevant is shaped by a limited range of signals, and as a result, different users are oriented within increasingly divergent fields of relevance. What matters is in one such field may not appear at all in another. What one takes to be obvious, urgent, or worth attending to may not even register elsewhere. This makes mutual understanding between us more difficult and encourages judgments formed within limited frames. That we misunderstand one another is not incidental but structurally encouraged. Where the limits of perspective remain unmarked, this can give rise to forms of violence in thought, speech, and action, not through intention necessarily, but through the systematic exclusion of what cannot be seen or taken into account. Now, what emerges from all this is, not simply the presence of multiple perspectives, nor the fact that each is limited. That is a given. The difficulty, again, lies in how those limited limits are handled. Perspectives become problematic not because they are partial, but because they are treated as if they were not. The question then is how to use them without extending them beyond the conditions under which they are warranted. Again, we need a discipline governing their extension, one that keeps what is said, assumed, or done tied to the circumstances that give it sense. And this is where Anekāntavāda comes in, because it is precisely such a discipline. Now, this is a rich slide, and you don't have to, look at it very closely. But it has been translated, Anekāntavāda, the term has been translated in many ways. Many-sidedness, non-absolutism, multiplexity, or as a general rejection of one-sidedness. These readings are not, interestingly, in competition with one another. They are compatible. And in a sense, they are even mutually supportive. The fact that a single formulation can sustain multiple non-exclusive readings like this is itself quite interesting and arguably an instance of what the Jain tradition describes as parasparopagraha, a form of mutual support that allows different aspects to stand together without cancellation. That's just an aside. As I said, this slide indicates several readings: ontological, methodological, and discursive. And I will not go through these in detail. We don't have that time, and I don't think it matters. What matters for present purposes is the role of the initial negation, an, which means not or non, and how it functions as a constraint on the extension of any one perspective. Now, if Anekāntavāda is understood in this way, it is not primarily a claim about how many sides reality has, nor a recommendation to adopt multiple perspectives. It is a general discipline governing how any perspective is to be used. What it regulates is not what we take to be the case, but how far we extend what we take to be the case. The negation an doesn't simply cancel what it negates. It doesn't eliminate one-sidedness by rejecting particular standpoints. Rather, it constrains their extension. Its force lies in preventing any one way of taking up a situation, any one perspective, from being treated as sufficient without qualification, as absolute. But not only is this negation not absolute in its effect, it also operates with scope, and you can see this on the slide. In any of its uses, an, the negation, functions as a form of restraint. But it is a restraint that can be applied in different ways, depending on how the scope of an is understood. It may limit the claim that reality is one, eka, yielding a recognition of plurality, many-sidedness. It may limit the claim that any one standpoint is exhaustive, ekanta, yielding a discipline of perspective. Or it may limit one-sided discourse, Anekāntavāda, yielding a form of articulation in which what is said is explicitly tied to the conditions under which it holds, and that's, for the insider, syadvad. For present purposes, we focus on the following. What is denied here is not the content of any particular perspective, but its unconditioned or one-sided extension. So what follows from this injunction on absolutizing perspectives is a discipline of articulation. Whatever one says is not withdrawn or to be withdrawn, but must be marked as conditional. as being assertable under conditions and maybe not under others. It's presented as holding in a certain respect under certain conditions from a certain standpoint. In this way, the elements often associated with Anekāntavāda, plurality, standpoint, and conditionality, emerge as direct consequences of how the phrase is grammatically built, right? As a direct consequences of this initial negation, an, and how it functions. Once the extension of any perspective is limited, what lies outside it, notably, remains. And that remainder appears as plurality. What is taken up is tied to a standpoint, since what is taken up becomes available only from certain perspectives, not others. And this expression, what we say and then consequently do, becomes conditional and conditionally rational, depending on the perspective, since what is said or done must indicate the scope within which it is valid, that is, the perspective from which its assertion is warranted. Now, the role of Anekāntavāda relevant today, then, is to provide a rule governing how perspectives are to be used. It requires that whatever is asserted, assumed, or done be accompanied by an awareness of its limits. Overreach, we said, consists in the unmarked extension of a limited perspective. Anekāntavāda enforces the marking of that limitation, thus preventing perspectives from being treated as complete. Now, if Anekāntavāda is understood as a discipline governing the extension of perspectives, it intrinsically relates to the notion of Ahiṃsā, or nonviolence. In fact, Ahiṃsā doesn't introduce a separate ethical principle alongside Anekāntavāda. Rather, it expresses what that discipline already amounts to when extended across thinking, speaking, and action. What has been described as overreach can now be seen more precisely. When a perspective is extended beyond the conditions under which it is warranted, what lies outside its scope is not merely left out, it's excluded. It can't appear as something that matters, and therefore cannot guide our response. In this sense, overreach is structurally violent. It doesn't require intention. It consists in the failure to leave room for what cannot be accommodated within the operative framework. From this perspective, nonviolence is not primarily a matter of refraining from harmful action, not primarily, also, but not primarily. It begins earlier at the level of how situations are taken up. To act nonviolently is to ensure that what one takes to be the case, at what one does on that basis, doesn't exceed the conditions under which it is warranted. It is to refrain from extending one's standpoint in ways that exclude what lies beyond it. And this applies across the same dimensions in which overreach operates. In thinking, it requires that what one understands be held as conditioned, rather than as exhaustive. In speaking, it requires that what one says and asserts be marked as holding in a certain respect, rather than as holding as such. In acting, it requires that what one does be guided by an awareness of what remains outside the range of what one has taken into account. In this sense, Ahiṃsā, nonviolence, can be understood as restraint, not as withdrawal, but as the disciplined limitation of extension of perspective. It doesn't require abandoning one's perspectives, how could one, nor that action be suspended. It requires that both remain tied to the conditions that license them. What is prevented, again, is not assertion or action as such, but their absolutization. Seen in this way, nonviolence is not an additional constraint imposed from the outside. Anekāntavāda, something metaphysical, methodological. Ahiṃsā, nonviolence, something separate, some ethical claim that's somehow separate. No, it is already present in the structure of how the negation in Anekāntavāda operates. Where the extension of a perspective is limited, what lies outside it remains available. It can appear, be taken into account, and potentially guide response. Nonviolence consists in maintaining the conditions under which this remains possible. Now, if Ahiṃsā, nonviolence, is understood in this way, then the restraint it recommends is not merely limiting. Nonviolence, Ahiṃsā, is also many-sided, we can say. It is also generative. It doesn't just limit. It doesn't just reduce what is available. It makes room for more. This can be seen by returning once more to the functioning of an, the negation. What is decisive is not a movement from eka, one, to aneka, many, as if plurality was simply the negation of oneness. What matters is the operation of the negation on itself. The negation introduced by on doesn't eliminate what it negates. It constrains, it limits extension without specifying or constraining in any way what lies beyond. Crucially, this depends on the negation itself being limited, bounded. I call this bounded negation, or for those who like the Sanskrit term, samaryada pratishedha. If it were absolute, the negation, like most Western negations are, it would not generate plurality, but simply replace one form of exclusion with another. Its generative force lies in the restraint. It is from this limitation that plurality emerges. When what is taken to be the case is not allowed to extend without qualification, it doesn't thereby disappear, nor does it occupy the whole. What lies beyond it remains. In this sense, plurality is not something added, but what becomes visible when extension is restrained. The movement then is from limitation to plurality. What appears as many-sidedness is the result of a disciplined limitation of what any one perspective, any one claim, or any one course of action is allowed to reach. Where limitation is observed, more than one way of taking up a situation can appear. The same holds at the level of perspective and action. When what one takes to be the case is held within its proper scope, it doesn't exclude what lies beyond it. Other ways of taking up the same situation remain available. When what one says is marked as holding in a certain respect, other articulations are not foreclosed. And when what one does is guided by an awareness of its limits, it doesn't preclude other responses. Restraint in this sense is what makes plurality visible and livable. It allows more than one perspective to stand, not by multiplying viewpoints, but by preventing any one of them from occupying the whole. Where limitation is observed, what lies beyond it can appear not as a threat, but as something that can be taken into account. So, the relation between limitation and plurality, in short, is not oppositional, but internal. What appears as many-sidedness is the result of a disciplined limitation of extension. To limit what one takes to be the case is at the same time to allow that there's more beyond what's being limited to be taken into account. So what's really interesting here to me is, so that's why I'm dwelling on the negation, that this is a really specific kind in which productive kind in which negation operates. And as far as I'm aware, there is no counterpart in Western logic. If you have a negation that in classical logic, what it does, it negates and cancels whatever is being negated completely. And this is not, right? This is not how this negation functions. It negates in a certain respect from a certain perspective, but leaves that thing which is being denied available to be assertable, doable, something that one can assume in other contexts, right? So it's denial, negation without cancellation, right? While leaving difference intact and just scoping the range within which certain options are negated and denied, and leaving scope for those very things to be assertable, doable, or something to be assumed elsewhere. So difference is not erased, but it's held in a balance, right? In a balance where all of these different views or claims or actions are allowed to be legitimate under different conditions. And again, that is unique as far as I can tell. Now, what has been so far described at the level of interaction and perception, and in the last couple of slides, somewhat abstractly, becomes even clearer and momentous when translated into concrete decisions. We've talked about, or I've talked about, the age of algorithm, and I've talked about chatbots. I've talked about large language modules. I've talked about social media feeds. Now, here's another way in which overreach plays out. So, consider algorithmic systems used in contexts such as insurance companies. So, what's happening there is that these systems operate on the basis of limited variables, patterns extracted from past data, correlations within a defined model. Within that scope, what they produce may be entirely appropriate. But the difficulty arises when this limited model is treated as sufficient for determining outcomes for everyone. What is captured within it is taken to define the case as such, absolutely. A partial view based on limited data and correlations becomes a total decision. At that point, the structure of overreach becomes consequential. What falls outside the model's range, features that are not represented, circumstances that are not captured, considerations that cannot be quantified, cannot enter into the decision. They are not rejected, they're simply not available as something that counts. So what's at issue here is not that the system itself is limited, all systems are. The issue is that its limits are not marked as limits. What is valid under certain conditions is treated as if it were sufficient without them. The result is a form of exclusion that is built into the decision process itself. From the perspective developed here, the question is then not whether such systems should be used, but how their scope is handled. What would it mean for such decision-making to remain tied to the conditions under which its outputs are in fact warranted, to register what lies outside the model as relevant, even where it cannot be formally represented? In these terms, nonviolence at the level of such systems, what consists not in abandoning decision, but in ensuring that these decisions do not extend beyond what they are able to take into account. And that where factors become visible and are available that should be taken into account and that do not fit the model are then taken into account. So seen from the perspective that I've been developing, this case, this insurance case, this structural case, is not a separate problem, but the same structure we've encountered throughout. What appeared at the beginning as frustration or miscommunication with a chatbot now appears as something more precise, a failure to keep what is said, assumed, or done within the conditions that license it. Where this failure is scaled and institutionalized through algorithmic procedures, its effects become correspondingly far-reaching. Okay, last slide. Conclusion. We can now return to our initial question. The difficulty of living with difference does not arise simply because perspectives differ. That's always the case. Nor because they are limited, which is also always the case. It arises because those limits are not observed. Where what is taken to be the case is extended beyond the conditions under which it is warranted, my mantra throughout this presentation, difference has no place to appear. It is neither dismissed, or it's either dismissed or absorbed into a framework that cannot accommodate it. In both cases, what lies outside that framework is excluded. In an age that's increasingly shaped by algorithmic systems, this problem becomes much more acute. These systems operate within limited models, but their outputs are often treated as if they were sufficient without qualification. What we encounter and what we take to be the case through our social media feeds, news outlets, and so on and so forth is shaped by processes that do not mark their own limits. And this makes overreach not only more likely, but more difficult to detect. The alternative is not to abandon perspectives, but to use them differently, to discipline how far they are extended. What is needed is a way of ensuring that what we say, assume, and do remains tied to the circumstances that give it sense. This is what Anekāntavāda, understood in this way, provides. It doesn't eliminate difference, nor does it resolve it. It allows us to recognize when a perspective is being extended beyond its conditions, and to limit it accordingly. In doing so, it preserves the space in which other perspectives can appear. To live with difference, then, is not to overcome it, but to refrain from extending our own perspective in ways that exclude what lies beyond it. It is to recognize that what we take to be the case holds under certain conditions, and to act accordingly. It is to limit what one assumes, what one does, and what one says. And this is where I stop. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Raja. That was wonderful. Um, well, so now we're of course going to invite the audience to please post your questions in the Q&A. And I would like to begin by just first of all commenting that uh, your discussion of the negation, the in aneka in the term, you started from the term itself, Anekāntavāda. I just want to say that your discussion totally tracks, my own research on the function of negations within Anekāntavāda itself. When you have these alpha privative or other sorts of negations within the theory that are negating certain predicates. So that is, you're saying, well, something is one way is, let's say, permanent and also not permanent or impermanent. And my research on I focus on the Shvetambara philosopher Haribhadra Suri, who was very influential in setting the terms for the tradition of Anekāntavāda. And I've argued that it does exactly what you were saying, that the negation does not it doesn't cancel and eliminate what it's negating, that it's a productive negation that is positing other possibilities essentially. So I just want to confirm and appreciate that. Um, and um, and I love the way that you characterize Anekāntavāda as a discipline governing the extension of claims and recognizing and maintaining their limits and blocking overreach. Um, my question for you is, i- do you think there are any ways in which um, that activity of limitation, that restraint, and disciplining can also problematically constrain discourse by sort of marginalizing claims, limiting claims that don't take themselves to be limited. Is that not also, does that not also risk, a certain kind of doing a certain kind of violence to those claims, marginalizing them, maybe even ch changing their meaning, changing the meaning of those claims or perspectives to make them maybe unrecognizable to their utterer.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you, first of all, for confirming. There's always great if these things converge, if research converges. And I mean, I'm not basing my analysis on Haribhadra Suri or on, actually, I'm just focusing on the grammar, right?
Yeah.
My initial question, just to know, as a matter of background, my initial question was like, why is it that there are these different meanings in the tradition of Anekāntavāda? Why are these different translations there, and how do they relate to one another? Why is there many-sidedness on the one hand, and why is there non-absolutism on the other hand? And how does Anekāntavāda and Nayavad and Syadvad, so perspectivalism, I know you don't like that term, but so let's bracket that for a moment, and Syadvad, conditional assertability, or the doctrine of conditional predication, how do these things actually relate to one another? And so what really unlocked this for me was the grammatical function of an. An can negate either eka, it can negate ekanta, or it can negate ekantavad, and that gives us the three readings. It's there in the grammar. But that also tells us something about an itself. That is a really interesting negation, right? So I'm fully agreed, and I'm just happy to see that what I'm finding through an analysis of grammar and the scope of negation, which is really a relevant and interesting function for negation to have that is, as I said, not anywhere discussed in contemporary analytic philosophy when you think about logic, when you think about negation. That's just a really interesting thing. But now you were asking, so this is just commenting on that. Your question was, is it not possible for the activity of limiting perspectives to be itself harmful, right? A form of himsa, of harm. And so the direct answer to that is yes, it is, right? But then, of course, it just like, so every activity should be conducted in a way that negates what is being negated in such a way as to leave what is being negated possible and available and assertable under other conditions, right? So that must also apply to the act of limiting itself, right? So you can limit another perspective in a way that's harmful, and you can limit it in a way that is not harmful. It depends on what the conditions are, what this perspective is from within which you're limiting, and what other perspectives are from which limiting could take place, and what limiting would look like from those, and whether you're leaving space for those to also exist. So, in a way, Anekāntavāda construed as a discipline of limiting is, and that is another really interesting feature of it, is reflexive. It applies to itself. And it applies to itself in a way that's stable. It doesn't turn into some sort of relativism or into some sort of collapse. It works, it stabilizes, right? So if you always have to heed to the conditions under which certain things are doable, assertable, or thinkable, right, then doing this, heeding these conditions, is itself something that can be done under conditions well or not well.
Mm. Okay, thank you. Um, uh, Going to the audience questions now. I think I want to go to the last one first, just because it's sort of continuous with what we've been discussing. So Ayan Siddiqui asks, how can negation be addressed without leaving a thought of rejection? So I think this is basically what we've been discussing. But can you, yeah, explain more fully for those who haven't quite grokked it yet? What it means to negate without rejecting, to have this generative kind of negation.
Well, if you say not something, you're kicking that something out of the discussion, right? So that's sort of what we typically think what not means, right? Not means something like, so not red, say, to take a very simple example, means, well, it has some other color. It is certainly not red. Now, what Anekāntavāda, the negation Anekāntavāda does is it says, not red under these conditions, which leaves open the possibility that under other conditions, it may well be assertable that the thing is red, right? So, and for objects, right, we can imagine all sorts of lighting conditions that are different, right? So that things that are red don't look red, or things that aren't red look red, right? So that's just a very simple perceptual case, right? But the point is, we are saying, if we're saying not something, we are saying not that something under the conditions of the perspective that I'm currently occupying. There may be other perspectives from which what I'm now saying is not accurate. I
Okay.
hope that clears
Thank
it
you.
up.
So, also kind of following, I think Agni Hogaboom's question. Agni, thanks you for your excellent talk. And then asks, you said that of Ahiṃsā and Anekāntavāda that for both the generative force lies in its restraint. So then continuing with this
Yes.
idea of that this restraint provides for a certain kind of generation. Can you speak more broadly about how generative force is valued or not in Jain philosophy? Many people understand Jain philosophy to
Mm,
advocate for the abandonment of action and
mm.
generation entirely.
Yes.
Good question.
Yes.
Thinking about this Anekāntavāda in a larger context of Jain doctrine.
That's a beautiful question. Thank you so much. It's yes. So as I take it already to be really interesting to see that, and the person asking the question seems to buy into that. So I'm glad. right? That the structure of Anekāntavāda itself, the phrase itself, already implements uh, this sort of nonviolent discipline. Typically, what people think, or often what people think, and how Jain philosophy is being presented, Anekāntavāda, aparigraha, so non-possessiveness, let's say, and Ahiṃsā, those are three independent principles, right? You have, or maybe aparigraha, non-possessiveness is sort of a form of non-violence, but and then there's Anekāntavāda, is somehow something complicated, and we're not talking about it that much. I'm of course simplifying, but often we're getting the idea that Ahiṃsā, non-violence, and Anekāntavāda are somehow separate. And what you've agreed with, I think, or the person asking is that no, they are not as different as they seem. They actually, Ahimsa, nonviolence is built into the structure. And also to the question, what about negation? If limitation is typically what's being focused on, right? We are limiting our reach. We are limiting our food intake. We are limiting what we earn or what we keep for ourselves to ourselves as opposed to giving it away. Focus is on limitation, right? In the tradition, I think that's quite right. But if Anekāntavāda is is correct, then everything is many-sided, right? And so it pays off, or it may pay off, to look at the other side of what negation is doing. It's limiting, yes, but the limiting act makes available the kind of space where other things can flourish. Now, is that something that is uh, very pronounced in the tradition? Probably not. Not as much. But I think it's very much part of it still, because the idea of limitation is also tied to the idea of not harming anyone, right? These two things, they belong together. We are in limiting our own overreach and trying to completely get rid of overreach. We are reducing harm and thereby enabling others to flourish. So the picture that we're getting is we're all limiting to such an extent that everyone has space. That's parasparopagraho jivanam. That's the mutual support of living beings. They depend on one another in who they are, but also in how they can flourish. And the key to this is limitation.
Yeah, and of course, in Jain ascetic practice, restraint makes possible a whole lifestyle and a whole system of ethics, and indeed a whole society in a certain way, and ultimately,
Yes.
makes possible. I mean, in the ultimate horizon, it's restraint that generates and makes possible freedom, right? I mean,
Yes,
as the ultimate.
exactly.
So
Yeah.
I think that is there very much and consistent with tradition. And I think we could bring although generation kind of can sound like a sort of a bad thing in the sort of ascetic renunciant framework,
Hmm.
we can ring the Anekāntavāda changes on that too, and just and ask, well,
Yes.
generation of what? I mean, what sort of generation? Yeah,
Yes.
getting limiting the generation of some things, but allowing the generation of other things. And I very much see that in the thinkers that I
Yeah.
study.
Good. I mean, so what I think, I fully agree. And I think, yes, it is uh, consonant with the tradition, no doubt. I think what the person asking, raising the question was asking, or at least that's how I understood it is, isn't there, isn't the focus in the tradition, lived and textual, often more on limitation and on restraint?
Hmm.
And I think there's something to that, right?
Sure.
But
Yeah.
maybe also because restraint is really difficult,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? Sort of carrying this through, as we know, following through on it is really difficult. So focusing on that may have pedagogical and pragmatic reasons too.
And maybe, I mean, just thinking out loud here, I mean, in your exposition, there seemed to be a sort of a priority of the restraint to the generation. It's the restraint that allows for the generation. And that maybe seems to be how it works in the tradition also, rather than
Well,
the
I,
other way
I think I
around.
prefer to say they're two sides of the same coin. But
Yeah.
yes, I mean, of course, on the first thing that we think is that's negation, right?
Yeah.
So that's restraint. Mm.
Um, uh, Jonathan Dickstein has asked, has also thanked you for the presentation, and especially in its connection to some contemporary issues, and has asked if you can share some of the Jain figures or sources that have advanced versions or parts of versions of your conceptions of Anekāntavāda and Ahiṃsā. Of course, I mentioned Hari Suri as being
Yes.
consistent in his treatment of negation, but he doesn't talk about the connection directly of Anekāntavāda to Ahiṃsā. So I guess that's what
Yes.
maybe Jonathan's asking about in particular.
Right. I'm going to be blunt and I'm going to say I have not found or I have not looked very hard for this in. So what I've looked for is the negation. What I've looked for is how it works. What I've looked for is ways to understand how it is that the different readings come about. And of course, we have contemporary figures like, or near contemporary figures like Matilal who insist on this, and then going further back, other people who've been insisting on this. Siddhasena Divakara is for me an important figure as well. So if you wanted to know what the classical anchor is, but this specific link between Anekāntavāda as implementing the structure of Ahiṃsā. I have not found this in the classical text. So if anyone were to find it or point me to it, this would be great. This would confirm something that I have extracted from how the grammar of the negation works.
Yeah,
So it's
I
a
mean, I think it's
reconstruction on
hard.
my part, but
Yeah,
I
yeah,
believe
totally.
it's sort of consistent with
Yeah.
the tradition, and I would very much welcome suggestions as to where this is articulated.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I unfortunately don't know of any myself either. I think they're very hard to find in the tradition, and this is, of course, this, the scholars among us know the critiques, most famously John Cort's critique of this idea of Anekāntavāda as intellectual ahimsa, and fundamentally a historical critique saying you don't find this in the tradition. So I think it has yet to be found. And I too would be very grateful to see exactly if someone can find sources for this in the tradition.
But I mean, I
Um,
think even independently of that, it doesn't need to be found, right? If the grammar and the philosophical force of what's being said points that in that direction, then and if we're not bringing in extraneous ideas and forces, there is a case to be made that this is
that,
assertable. Yeah.
that this is already present there in
Yeah.
implicitly in the tradition, even if it hasn't been
Yes.
made explicit by traditional thinkers.
Or we've lost those texts. Always
Right.
possible.
Yeah, that's certainly always possible. I want to bring it to we could bring it back to issues of practical issues, and we have a great question from Godfrey Dungu who commends you on the great conversation, and says the concept of overreaching was provocative to me and made me think about my profession. In mental health settings, clinicians often rely on standardized categories and treatment protocol. As a mental health professional, how can I tell when these are supporting understanding versus when they begin to overreach and limit my client's ability to express what matters to them?
Good. Hi, Godfrey. Godfrey is a colleague of mine at Fresno State. So, great question. No, I mean, we do know that in psychology, there's a distinction between approaches that try to quantify data and look at comparison sets and so on, and approaches that are individual focused, right? And basically, what Anekāntavāda pushes us towards is to say that, well, whatever we framework we use, right? If we treat the framework as absolute, then we run the risk of not capturing the individual that's there, right? So that's the issue. And how does one prevent this? Well, one has to be open-minded, one has to be empathetic, one has to listen to what the other person is saying, not just listening to it and trying to interpret it, but also trying to figure out whether the interpretation that one is coming up with is one that the person one is interpreting is willing to sustain. That's an extended process. It's a lot of work. But I think that's what a good therapist or psychotherapist, for instance, or counselor would need to do.
Great. Well, thank you so much. That brings us to the hour, and I think it's time for us to wrap up. You have several uh, plaudits, is that the word? People applauding you in the Q&A. Nayeli Sanchez and Parveen Jain Ji saying thank you. Excellent, informative talk. Very good Q&A session, and good job, Professor Raja. I agree completely.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you all in the audience for being here and for your great questions.
Indeed.
Thank you both. And it was really an honor to kick it off with this event. I remember having the initial conversations with Raja at the AAR about this topic. I can see how it's developed, and I'm so glad that Professor Anil Mundra has been willing to moderate this session and these wonderful conversations that will continue. So thank you both to Professors Rosenhagen and Mundra. Our next event will be on May 4th with Ana Funes on practicing Anekāntavāda in times of crisis, public dialogue, health, and vaccine hesitancy. So I welcome you all to join and to take part in that conversation around engaged Anekāntavāda. We look forward to seeing you all soon. Jai Jinendra.
Jai
Thank you
Jinendra.
so
Thank
much.
you.